September 12, 1944. The Pacific sun was already brutal at 0800 hours when Major Robert Cowboy Stout climbed into the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat aboard the USS Hornet. The carrier deck was organized chaos, deck crews in colored jerseys scrambling between our aircraft, the smell of aviation fuel mixing with salt air, and the constant roar of engines warming up for the day's missions. Stout had flown 63 combat missions by this point, but something about this morning felt different. Intelligence briefings the night before had been vague, almost dismissive. The target was Peleliu, a speck of coral and jungle in the Palau Islands that most Americans had never heard of. In 3 days, 15,000 Marines would storm those beaches in what commanders promised would be a quick 3-day operation. Spoiler alert, it would take 2 months and cost nearly 10,000 casualties. But Stout didn't know that yet. His mission was simple on paper. Fly reconnaissance over the northern airfield, snap some photos, report back. The brass needed to confirm that Japanese air power in the region was minimal. Earlier reconnaissance flights had reported the airfields as abandoned or lightly defended. Stout's job was essentially checking a box before the invasion kicked off. He'd done dozens of these milk runs before, boring, routine, the kind of mission where the biggest danger was falling asleep at the stick during the long flight back. Except this time, intelligence was catastrophically wrong. As Stout's Hellcat approached Peleliu from the east, flying at 8,000 feet, he began his standard photo run protocol. The camera mounted behind his cockpit would automatically capture overlapping images as he flew straight and level over the target area. That's when he saw it, a sight that made his blood run cold and his tactical mind shift into overdrive in the same instant. The airfield wasn't abandoned, it was packed. Rows and rows of Japanese aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip on the tarmac like sardines in a can. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, those nimble fighters that had dominated the early war. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, all fueled, all armed, all ready to shred the invasion fleet that was steaming toward Peleliu at that very moment. Stout counted quickly. His combat experience let him estimate aircraft density fast. 40 planes minimum, possibly more, tucked under camouflage netting near the jungle edge. This wasn't a token defensive force. This was a strike group positioned and ready to launch a devastating attack on the American ships just over the horizon. If those planes got airborne during the invasion, they'd tear through the vulnerable transport ships carrying Marines. Thousands of men would die in the water before they ever touched the beach. The entire operation could collapse into a bloodbath that would make Tarawa look like a practice drill. His radio crackled with routine check-ins from other pilots in the area, their voices calm and professional. Stout's thumb hovered over the transmit button. Protocol demanded he report this immediately, break off, and let the fleet scramble a proper strike package. But by the time he flew back, filed a report, and convinced skeptical intelligence officers that they'd missed an entire airbase, precious hours would burn away. The Japanese would disperse these aircraft, hide them in revetments or worse, launch them against the fleet. Right now, they were sitting ducks, completely exposed, probably waiting for dawn reconnaissance to confirm the invasion fleet's position before launching their own attack. Stout made another pass, this time dropping to 3,000 feet to get a better look, his photographer's eye cataloging every detail, even as his fighter pilot instinct screamed warnings about anti-aircraft positions. The airfield stretched along the northern coast of Peleliu, a single runway carved out of coral and jungle, with dispersal areas fanning out on both sides. What caught his attention wasn't just the number of aircraft, it was how they were arranged. Someone on the ground had made a fatal mistake, probably driven by the urgency of preparing for their own strike mission. The planes were parked in tight, neat rows, barely 15 feet separating each aircraft. Standard procedure would have them spread out, hidden under trees, protected by revetments. Instead, they looked like they were lined up for inspection day at flight school. Through his canopy, Stout could see ground crews moving between the aircraft. Tiny figures in khaki uniforms were rolling fuel drums, carrying ammunition belts, performing pre-flight checks. They had no idea an American fighter was circling above them. Why would they? Japanese early warning radar in this sector was primitive at best, and single aircraft reconnaissance flights were common enough that they rarely triggered a full alert. The complacency was palpable, even from 3,000 feet up. These crews thought they owned the sky this morning. They thought they had time. Stout's tactical analysis was running at full speed now. He'd been trained in ground attack at Pensacola, spent weeks practicing strafing runs on target sleds and painted truck hulks. The doctrine was straightforward: come in low and fast, hit your target in a single devastating pass, then get out before ground fire could track you. But doctrine assumed you'd be attacking one or two targets, not an entire air base. His Hellcat carried 650 caliber machine guns in the wings, 3 per side, each gun loaded with 400 rounds. That gave him 2,400 rounds total, and at the Browning M2's cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute, he could sustain about 12 seconds of continuous fire before running dry. 12 seconds to destroy 40 planes. The math didn't work, not in any conventional sense. But the more Stout studied the layout, the more he realized conventional thinking didn't apply here. Those aircraft weren't just parked close together. They were parked next to their fuel supplies. He could see the drums stacked beside each plane, probably high-octane aviation gasoline waiting to be pumped into tanks for the morning strike. One tracer round into a fuel drum would turn it into a bomb. One burning aircraft would spread fire to its neighbors. The Japanese had accidentally created a massive chain reaction waiting to happen. This wasn't going to be about shooting down 40 planes individually. This was about lighting a fuse and letting thermodynamics do the rest of the work. He checked his fuel gauge, enough for the strike and the flight back with a reasonable reserve. His ammunition counters showed full loads on all 6 guns. The Hellcat felt solid under him, responsive, ready. This aircraft had brought him through 63 missions. He trusted it like a good horse, but trust didn't eliminate risk. Down there, somewhere in the jungle surrounding that airfield, Japanese anti-aircraft positions were waiting. Type 96 25mm autocannons, probably the standard light AA weapon in the Japanese inventory. They'd be scanning the sky, fingers on triggers. Once he made his first pass, once those machine guns started roaring, every gun position on that island would light him up. He'd be alone, unsupported, flying into a storm of steel, no wingman to cover him, and no rescue if he went down. The decision point crystallized in Stout's mind with absolute clarity. Every second he spent circling was another second those aircraft sat ready to kill American sailors and Marines. He could radio back to the carrier, wait for orders, watch as a proper strike package got organized. Cap fighters, dive bombers, the whole coordinated ballet of naval aviation. That would take 90 minutes minimum, probably closer to 2 hours with briefings and launch sequences. By then, Japanese spotters would have reported the invasion fleet's position. Those 40 aircraft would be airborne, scattered, hunted. The window of opportunity would slam shut forever. Military doctrine existed for good reasons. Coordination saved lives, overwhelming force minimized risk, proper planning prevented disasters. Stout had sat through all the lectures at flight school, absorbed all the lessons about never engaging without support. But doctrine also couldn't account for every situation. Sometimes war handed you a moment that existed outside the rule, a convergence of circumstances that would never have been. This was that moment. 40 enemy aircraft packed together like ammunition in a magazine, completely vulnerable, capable of changing the entire course of the Palladium invasion if left intact. And one American pilot with a loaded Hellcat and the skill of cruising. The rational part of Stout's brain cataloged all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Anti-aircraft fire could shred his Hellcat on the first pass, sending him cartwheeling into the jungle in a ball of flame. A lucky shot could sever his hydraulic lines, leaving him unable to control the aircraft. His guns could jam. It happened, even with the reliable Brownings, especially in the humid Pacific air. He could misjudge his altitude in the attack run and plow straight into the ground at 300 miles per hour. Any of these outcomes meant dying alone on a nameless island, his body never recovered, his family receiving a telegram with the antiseptic phrase, "missing in action, presumed dead." But the other side of that equation was equally clear. If those Japanese planes launched their 40 enemy aircraft sat beneath him like targets on a practice range. There was also something else, something harder to quantify but impossible to ignore, the pure tactical opportunity of it all. In 63 combat missions, Stout had never seen enemy aircraft this perfectly positioned for destruction. Most air combat in the Pacific involved desperate dogfights at altitude, burning fuel chasing elusive Zeros through clouds, or attacking heavily defended positions with minimal results. This was different. This was every fighter pilot's fantasy scenario, the kind of opportunity that pilots bragged about in ready rooms but never actually encountered. The Japanese had made a mistake, a terrible operational error, and war was about exploiting enemy mistakes before they could correct them. Stout's hand moved to the throttle, pushing it forward. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney engine responded with a deep-throated roar, 18 cylinders generating 2,000 horsepower. He nosed the aircraft down, beginning his descent. No more radio calls, no more reconnaissance orbits. The decision was made. In 30 seconds, he'd either become a legend or a statistic. Either way, those Japanese planes weren't going to attack the invasion fleet. He'd make sure of that, or die trying. The Hellcat dropped like a hawk spotting prey, Stout's altimeter unwinding through 2,000 feet, 1,500. He leveled off at 50 feet above the treetops, so low that palm fronds whipped in his prop wash. At this altitude, he was below most radar coverage and inside the envelope where anti-aircraft gunners struggled to track fast-moving targets. The airfield rushed toward him, and he had maybe 3 seconds to finalize his attack geometry. The rows of Japanese aircraft were oriented northeast to southwest, parked parallel to the runway. Stout planned his approach perpendicular to those rows, which meant he'd be crossing multiple lines of aircraft in a single pass instead of following one row down its length. More targets in his cone of fire, more chances to trigger the chain reaction he was counting on. His airspeed indicator read 310 miles per hour as he cleared the last line of jungle. The airfield opened up before him like a shooting gallery, and suddenly he could see individual details with startling clarity. Ground crew members looking up in confusion, their faces visible for a split second before recognition turned to panic. Fuel drums stacked 3 high beside each aircraft, a Zero with its engine cowling open, maintenance still in progress. Stout's thumb found the firing button on his control stick. The .650 caliber Brownings were synchronized to converge at a point 300 yards ahead, creating a devastating cone of fire that would tear through anything in its path. Each gun fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds mixed with standard ball ammunition, a combination designed to penetrate aircraft skin and ignite fuel systems. He pressed the button. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns opened up simultaneously, the sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. Tracers arced out from his wings in brilliant streams, every 5th round glowing red hot so pilots could walk their fire onto target. Stout aimed for the first row of aircraft, specifically targeting the gap between 2 Zeros where he could see fuel drums clustered. The .50 caliber rounds walked across the coral tarmac, kicking up white dust, then stitched into the first Zero's fuselage. Metal skin peeled away like tissue paper under the onslaught. He held the trigger down for 2 full seconds, about 25 rounds per gun, 150 rounds total, then adjusted his aim slightly left. The fuel drums exploded, not all at once, but in a cascading sequence that looked choreographed. The first drum erupted in an orange fireball that immediately spread to its neighbors. High-octane aviation gasoline doesn't just burn, it detonates when atomized and ignited, creating overpressure waves that propagate through vapor. The explosion caught the Zero's wing tank, which had probably been topped off for that morning's planned strike. The fighter disappeared in a secondary blast that sent burning fuel spraying across 2 adjacent aircraft. Stout was already past them, his tracers finding the next row, hammering into a Nakajima torpedo bomber's bloated fuselage. This aircraft was bigger, heavier, and absolutely packed with fuel for long-range strikes against ships. When it went up, the blast was powerful enough that Stout felt the shockwave buffet his Hellcat even as he raced past at 300 miles per hour. He was 4 seconds into the run now, roughly halfway across the airfield. Behind him, fires were spreading with terrifying speed. The Japanese had parked these aircraft close enough that burning fuel from one cooled under its neighbors. Aircraft aluminum melts at 1,220 degrees Fahrenheit. Avgas burns at 2,500 degrees. Wing tanks were rupturing from heat stress even before flames touched them, dumping hundreds of gallons of fuel that flash ignited instantly. Ground crew members were running in every direction, some trying to reach fire equipment, most just fleeing for their lives. Anti-aircraft positions were starting to react, muzzle flashes winking from camouflaged positions near the runway, but they were firing blindly, tracking smoke and chaos rather than the Hellcat that had already blown past their fields of fire. Stout kept his finger on the trigger, hosing rounds across the third and fourth rows of parked aircraft. A line of Aichi dive bombers absorbed his fire, their thin aluminum skins providing zero protection against 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. One of them had ordnance still loaded. He glimpsed bombs slung under the wings in the fraction of a second before his tracers found them. The explosion was catastrophic, a massive detonation that sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke boiling upward. Shrapnel from the blast shredded two nearby Zeros like a giant shotgun blast, turning pristine fighters into twisted metal sculptures in an eye blink. The shockwave was strong enough that debris pattered against Stout's canopy, small fragments of aircraft pinging off the reinforced glass. The entire airfield was transforming into hell on Earth. What had started as surgical strikes on fuel drums had evolved into an uncontrolled conflagration. Fire was jumping from aircraft to aircraft, spreading through pools of burning gasoline that flowed across the tarmac, following the slight grade of the runway. Secondary explosions were popping off every few seconds as ammunition cooked off inside burning aircraft. Machine gun rounds for the fighters, 20mm cannon shells, even some of the smaller bombs that hadn't been loaded yet. Each explosion fed the chaos, creating more shrapnel, more fires, more destruction. The smoke was rising in thick black columns now, the kind of smoke that would be visible from the carrier task force 50 miles away. Ground crew members who'd been performing maintenance were trapped between burning aircraft and the jungle. Stout caught glimpses of them in his peripheral vision as he roared past. Men diving into drainage ditches, others beating at flames with jackets in futile attempts to save aircraft that were already doomed. A fuel truck that had been servicing the bombers took a burst of his fire and exploded with enough force to flip it onto its side, its cargo of high-octane fuel adding another 1,000 gallons to the inferno. The heat was intense enough now that Stout could feel it in his cockpit even at 300 miles per hour. A wave of thermal energy that made the air shimmer and distorted his view of the targets ahead. His ammunition counters were winding down fast. He'd burned through about half his load in that first devastating pass, maybe 1,200 rounds across all 6 guns. But the destruction was multiplying beyond anything he could have achieved through gunfire alone. The Japanese had created a perfect storm of vulnerability. Concentrated fuel supplies, tightly packed aircraft, inadequate fire suppression equipment, and probably minimal training for ground crews on how to handle this kind of disaster. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong for them, and Stout was the catalyst that had set it all in motion. He pulled up sharply at the end of the airfield, climbing to 500 feet to assess the damage and plan his next move. Anti-aircraft fire was intensifying now. Black puffs of 25mm shells bursting around his aircraft as gunners finally got their range. Tracers from light machine guns arced up from multiple positions, creating a web of fire he had to navigate through. The Japanese were panicking, firing at anything that moved, but their accuracy was terrible. Fear and smoke were ruining their aim. Stout banked hard right, using his altitude advantage to stay outside the envelope of the heaviest ground fire while he took stock of what he'd accomplished. The northern section of the airfield was completely engulfed. At least 15 aircraft were burning or already destroyed, reduced to blackened skeletons of their former selves. But the southern section still had intact targets. He counted another 20 to 25 aircraft that his first pass hadn't touched. Some were already being moved by desperate ground crews trying to taxi them away from the fires, which was exactly the wrong thing to do, because it turned stationary targets into moving ones that were harder to hit, but still just as vulnerable. Stout grinned behind his oxygen mask. They were making his job easier. He pushed the stick forward, lining up for his second run. The second pass was going to be different, and Stout knew it. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a fully alerted enemy who'd watched the first attack turn their airfield into a crematorium. Every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu was tracking him now, crews frantically cranking elevation wheels and leading his flight path. The smoke was also a factor. Thick columns of black rising thousands of feet, obscuring targets and creating turbulence that made precise flying nearly impossible. But those remaining aircraft on the southern dispersal area represented just as much threat as the ones already burning. He couldn't leave them intact. He came in from a different angle this time, approaching from the southeast instead of retracing his first run. Basic survival tactics. Never repeat the same attack pattern because gunners learn to anticipate your path. His airspeed was slightly lower, around 280 miles per hour, giving him better target resolution, but also making him more vulnerable to ground fire. The trade-off was necessary. At 310 miles per hour, everything had been a blur. At 280, he could pick specific targets and make every remaining round count. His ammunition situation was getting critical. Maybe 800 rounds left across all 6 guns, which translated to about 6 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. The anti-aircraft fire was a light show of death. Tracers crisscrossed his flight path, some passing so close he could see the glowing projectiles streaking past his canopy. A 25mm shell burst 30 feet to his left, close enough that shrapnel rattled against his fuselage. Another burst dead ahead, forcing him to jink right and spoil his aim for a precious second. The Japanese gunners were getting better, adjusting to his speed and altitude, setting up kill boxes he had to fly through. Stout's training took over. Never fly straight for more than 2 seconds. Always be changing something, altitude or heading or speed. Make yourself an impossible target to predict. He opened fire on a group of 5 Zeros that ground crews were desperately trying to taxi toward the jungle. His tracers found the lead aircraft, raking it from propeller to tail. The Zero's fuel tank erupted, and suddenly the pilot was scrambling out of the burning cockpit, his flight suit already on fire. The aircraft rolled to a stop and became another torch. Stout adjusted aim, caught the second Zero as it tried to swing away, hammered rounds into its engine. Coolant sprayed in a white mist. The engine seized and the plane shuddered to a halt. 3 more bursts took out 2 more fighters in the group. The 5th Zero made it to the tree line before a lucky shot from Stout's last few rounds punctured something vital and it nosed over into the jungle, out of commission even if not destroyed. His guns clicked empty on the port side. The 3 left-wing Brownings had run dry. He still had his starboard guns, maybe 300 rounds remaining, but the asymmetric firepower made aiming trickier. The Hellcat wanted to pull left from the unbalanced recoil. He compensated with rudder pressure, finding more targets. A pair of dive bombers sat near a camouflaged revetment, probably being armed for a strike. He walked his remaining tracers across both aircraft, punching holes through cockpits and fuel cells. One caught fire immediately. The other just sat there leaking fuel until the spreading flames from its neighbor reached the puddle, and both aircraft went up together in a satisfying double explosion. Something slammed into his Hellcat's tail section, a solid hit that made the whole aircraft shudder. Stout's eyes flashed to his instrument panel, checking for red lights or falling gauge needles. Oil pressure holding steady, hydraulics nominal, control surfaces still responding. Whatever had hit him hadn't severed anything critical, but it was a reminder that his luck couldn't hold forever. Every second he stayed over this airfield increased the probability that a Japanese gunner would get lucky and put a shell somewhere his Hellcat couldn't absorb. He squeezed off his last burst at a fuel truck near the runway, watched it explode in flames, then pulled up hard and headed for open ocean. His starboard guns were dry now, too. All 2,400 rounds, expended in roughly 15 seconds of actual trigger time, spread across 2 passes. Behind him, the airfield at Peleliu was dying. Stout risked one look back over his shoulder as he climbed to a safer altitude, and the sight was almost unreal in its completeness. The entire northern section was an inferno. columns of black smoke merging into a single massive pillar that rose over 10,000 feet into the tropical sky. The southern section wasn't much better. Nearly every aircraft he'd targeted on his second pass was burning or disabled, adding their smoke to the apocalyptic scene. From 5 miles away, the heat shimmer was visible, distorting the air above the runway like a mirage. Ground crews had abandoned any pretense of fighting the fires and were simply trying to survive, staying clear of the ammunition that continued to cook off in random staccato bursts. The tactical implications were staggering, and Stout's mind shifted from immediate survival to strategic assessment as his adrenaline began to level out. 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed or rendered inoperable in approximately 8 minutes of action. That wasn't just a successful strike, it was the complete elimination of Japanese air power in the Peleliu sector. Those aircraft had represented the Japanese Navy's planned response to the American invasion. Without them, the Japanese garrison on Peleliu was blind and defenseless against air attack. The Marines landing on September 15th, just 3 days away, would have total air superiority from the moment their landing craft hit the beach. The math was brutal but simple. Each of those torpedo bombers could have sunk or crippled a transport ship, and each transport carried roughly 1/500 Marines plus their equipment. A coordinated strike by even half of those 40 aircraft could have devastated the invasion fleet, turning the shallow waters off Peleliu into a graveyard. Stout had prevented that nightmare scenario single-handedly. The Marines who would storm those beaches wouldn't know his name, wouldn't know that their unopposed landing was made possible by one pilot's decision to attack an entire airbase alone. But they'd be alive because of it. That was the calculus of war. Invisible chains of cause and effect, where individual actions rippled outward to save or doom thousands. There was also the broader strategic picture. Japanese commanders throughout the Palau Islands had been counting on those aircraft for offensive and defensive operations. Without them, the entire theater balance shifted. American carriers could operate closer to shore, providing better close air support for ground troops. Reconnaissance flights could map Japanese positions without fighter opposition. Supply ships could make runs to the beachhead without fear of air attack. One successful strafing run had fundamentally altered the operational environment for the entire Peleliu campaign. But Stout also knew, with the clear-eyed realism of a combat veteran, that Peleliu was still going to be hell for the Marines who landed there. The Japanese garrison of roughly 11,000 men was dug into the island's coral ridges and limestone caves, fortifications that no amount of air superiority could eliminate. The ground fighting would be savage, cave by cave and ridge by ridge, some of the bloodiest combat in Pacific War history. His attack had removed one major threat, but it hadn't changed the fundamental reality that Peleliu was a fortress that would have to be taken at terrible cost. Still, every Marine who made it off the landing beaches alive, because Japanese planes weren't strafing them, represented a victory that mattered. His fuel gauge was reading lower than he liked, the combat maneuvering and high-speed passes having burned through his reserves faster than planned. He pointed the Hellcat's nose toward the coordinates where the USS Hornet should be, and settled into a steady cruise climb. The hole in his tail section was causing some minor drag, making the aircraft slightly tail-heavy, but nothing he couldn't compensate for with trim adjustments. The radio came alive with urgent chatter, other pilots reporting the massive smoke column rising from Peleliu, carrier controllers demanding to know what was happening, confusion and alarm spreading through the fleet. Stout keyed his microphone and delivered the most understated after-action report of his career. Hornet Control, this is Stout. Mission complete. Peleliu airfield neutralized. Returning to base. The radio went silent for several seconds before the controller responded, his voice carefully professional but unable to hide his disbelief. Say again your last, Stout. Did you say neutralized? Stout allowed himself a small smile. Affirmative. The airfield is no longer operational. You'll want to scramble a photo bird to get documentation. Out. Stout's Hellcat touched down on the Hornet's deck 40 minutes later, the tail hook snagging the number 3 wire with a jolt that snapped his body forward against the harness straps. Deck crews swarmed the aircraft immediately. their eyes going wide when they saw the damage, the tail section riddled with shrapnel holes, hydraulic fluid streaking the fuselage, and scorch marks on the wings from flying through his own explosions. The plane captain who climbed up to help Stout out of the cockpit just stared at him, then at the empty ammunition counters, then back at Stout. The whole deck seemed to pause as word spread that the pilot who created that massive smoke column visible from 50 miles away had just landed. By the time Stout's boots hit the deck, a crowd had formed. The intelligence debriefing lasted 3 hours. Stout sat in the carrier's intelligence center with maps spread across the table, walking senior officers through every detail of the attack while photo reconnaissance birds confirmed his damage assessments. The pictures told the story better than words. 40 aircraft reduced to burned-out husks, the airfield cratered and smoking, fires still burning hours after the attack. The intelligence officers kept asking the same questions in different ways, as if they couldn't quite believe one pilot had accomplished this alone. How many passes did you make? Just 2. How much ammunition did you expend? All of it. Were you hit? Yes, but nothing critical. Did you have wingmen? No. The questions eventually stopped, replaced by a silence that felt like reverence mixed with disbelief. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross for the Peleliu mission, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces." But the official recognition came months later, long after Stout had flown dozens more missions and the war had ground forward through more islands, more invasions, more desperate fights. He never talked much about Peleliu with other pilots, deflecting questions with modest shrugs and changes of subject. In the ready-room culture of carrier aviation, where egos ran hot and pilots competed to tell the best war stories, Stout's reticence stood out. He'd done something genuinely extraordinary, but he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention it brought. After the war ended in August 1945, Stout returned to civilian life with the same quiet determination that had characterized his military service. He settled in California, worked in the aerospace industry during the post-war boom, raised a family, and lived a life that looked completely ordinary from the outside. He rarely mentioned his combat record, even to close friends. His children grew up barely knowing their father had been a decorated Navy pilot. It wasn't until decades later, when military historians began documenting the Pacific War's lesser-known actions, that Stout's Peleliu mission started receiving the attention it deserved. Researchers digging through after-action reports and carrier deck logs found the documentation of his solo attack and recognized it as one of the most devastating single-pilot strikes in aviation history. The mission's influence on military doctrine was subtle, but real. Air Force and Navy tactical schools studied Stout's attack as a case study in exploiting enemy mistakes and understanding secondary effects. The principle of attacking concentrated enemy assets to create cascading failures became a cornerstone of ground attack strategy. His willingness to act decisively when presented with a fleeting opportunity, even outside the bounds of his original orders, became an example of the kind of initiative that modern militaries try to cultivate in their officers. The mission proved that under the right circumstances, one pilot with skill, courage, and a bit of luck could change the course of a battle. Stout passed away in 1989 at the age of 73, having lived to see the Cold War end and the military tactics he'd helped pioneer become standard doctrine. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Navy service, but gave it only a single paragraph, focusing instead on his career and family. The people who attended his funeral mostly had no idea that the quiet man they'd known had once destroyed an entire enemy airbase in 8 minutes of violence over a forgotten island in the Pacific. But the Marines who landed on Peleliu's beaches on September 15, 1944, and weren't torn apart by torpedo bombers and dive bombers. They owed their lives to a decision one pilot made in the seconds before he pushed his Hellcat into a dive and opened fire on 40 sitting targets. That's the legacy that matters, the one measured not in medals or citations, but in the thousands of men who came home because Robert Cowboy Stout decided that some opportunities only come once, and some risks are worth taking.